Hi everyone, and I'm so sorry I can't be there with you today. I've given this talk before, I've updated my slides and they pretty much reflect why Shruti always asks me to give this talk, because she's asked me to talk about keeping a balance. And I have a number of different reasons why I've had to learn how to do that, and I'm going to discuss those with you today, so I hope it's helpful. As you can see, updating my slides, I literally crossed stuff out because then you can see how things can change. And it was only about a year ago that I gave this talk last. So things can change really quickly, even after you've been a consultant for what is now 11 years for me. So my name is j.szram. I am a newly appointed professor, and I have a Twitter handle that you can see there and an email. You're very welcome to contact me, and the website for my clinical work, which is the first consultant job that I have ever had and still have as a respiratory physician. I also work for Health Education England. I became a postgraduate dean in July. And I work at the Royal College of Physicians as the Lineker Fellow, which I'll explain a bit later. And finally, I chair an organisation that used to be called NACT, but is now called Medical Education Leaders UK. I hope the name probably describes what the point of that group is. If you want to know a little bit more about me in general and my history, then there is a sort of a blog, but we had a lot of help writing them for the This Doctor Can campaign that the RCP ran, really just trying to explain how everyone's life is different and there's a lot of narrative that can be quite rich learning as you navigate your own life and career. So that link is on the slides, and I'm sure Shruti will be sharing the slides with you in due course. So who am I right now? Well, right now I'm a consultant respiratory physician. I work in a really niche specialty called occupational lung disease, which has its great advantages of being amenable to portfolio working. I can pretty much park all of my clinical work in one working day, which makes it possible for me to have lots of other roles, which is what I've found a real richness to my career has been. But I just want you to know that I didn't start out life in my consultant career like that. I had a fully clinical job. I did ward work. I looked after lots of people with severe asthma, lots of people with undiagnosed breathlessness, and worked very much in a tertiary respiratory centre, but very much on call and busy and hands-on. But over time, I came to understand what really drove me was the desire to improve the system, particularly through education, but more in recent years about development and leadership of teams and individuals and groups, and obviously of our profession. So I'm also a clinical appraisal lead at the Trust, which is a brilliant job. I really enjoy developing my colleagues as they become consultants. I look after the SAS doctors as well, and I look after the appraisers and their development, of whom Shruti is one. I have an academic appointment at Imperial College, which is where I do my PhD, my research, and a little bit of active research interest now, but very little. But in July, as I said, I became postgraduate dean, and with that I became a responsible officer, which is a GMC role. So I look after several thousand trainees and their GMC fitness to practice, which is a huge responsibility, the clue's in the name, but also a real joy to support people as they navigate their training and ensure that everything is done to support people who need additional help due to lots of reasons. As I mentioned, I have a college role. I strongly recommend you do engage with whichever college you're affiliated to, as well as your specialist societies, particularly when you become a new consultant. It's really helpful. And that's how I got into the jobs that I've got at college now. I got elected to council, and then I became an elected trustee councillor, which means I get to go to the board and understand the finances of college, and it's a brilliant development opportunity to understand how to run an organisation. Along the way, I picked up this role of Lineker Fellow, which is a great advocacy support role for college tutors, playing to my educational strengths. As prior to these roles, I was the Director of Medical Education in my trust and an educational supervisor and a programme director. So I have a lot of experience in education and training, which has always been something I've been passionate about, actually since before I became a doctor, for various reasons. And I also, as part of my college affiliations, I'm an associate editor on their journal, which is called Future Healthcare, and I encourage you to have a look at it. It's free to access, lots of good stuff in there, but also very good place to publish quality improvement. And you know, when you're starting out, if you haven't had a lot of experience publishing, it's a really good place to start. And finally, my as I call it, my hobby job, because it's completely unpaid and I do it around the sides, is as chair, now emeritus chair of Medical Education Leaders UK. We had to invent that title because actually, as a postgraduate dean, you are generally accountable to your Director of Medical Education in terms of supporting them. And I've felt, and actually the Council of Medical Education Leaders UK felt that it was not possible to do both those jobs. And so I effectively co-chair, but I've stood back, and the chair-elect has become the acting chair until the next election process occurs in May. So we're in sort of process of transition, which is, again, a lot of fun. We've had to make that up as we go along. Most importantly, I started life as someone's daughter and a sister, because my brothers came next. Obviously, I've had friends, and I still have some friends. Got married, had kids. You know, I live in a community with neighbours, and you know, all of those things are as important as all the things above that. And they don't tend to figure highly on the CV, do they? But that does not mean you should ignore them. And they're absolutely the key to balance, I think, in any role, but particularly important when you become a consultant. So how do I do it? And how might you learn from that? That's the next part of the talk. The first thing to say from my experience is that we all love a plan. Doctors like plans. I've always been a planner. I always have diaries and schedules and books and notebooks and plans. And we think everything's going to be linear and straightforward, and we can see the path ahead. And as we go through life, and particularly during consultant jobs, I've found that the reality is not quite that lovely straight line with no bumps. I think for many people, training is like that too, and perhaps even before that, getting into medical school, getting through medical school, or perhaps your life has been like that. I mean, we've all had really tough times, I'm sure. I mean, certainly most recently, most of us have. But I had some really big stuff happen to me in my life too. So, for example, my dad died when I was a medical reg, quite suddenly. I was on call, actually, night shift. So it was a big moment because it was a sudden death, unexpected, and a lot to navigate there for me, my whole family, and you know, my career up to a point. So it did cause some turbulence to that, and obviously having been in training and having that happen to me gives me a lot of empathy and compassion for my trainees when stuff happens to them through no fault at all of their own, but can really affect them. But you know, smaller things happen as well, don't they? Like you decide to move house, or you decide actually maybe the specialty isn't for you, all sorts of stuff. Or you don't get a job that you think you really wanted. I've not got 2 jobs recently in that last sort of 10 years or so. It's not fun. You learn a lot from not getting jobs. In fact, failure is a great learning point, but it doesn't feel like that at the time. It feels like everyone's raining on you. But sense of achievement when you do get something like becoming a postgraduate dean is immense. I didn't draw this, as you can see. I got this from a really good leadership program I went to at Harvard Macy Institute in Boston. It was a brilliant week, and it's now run virtually. So if you want to invest long term in your particularly leadership development, this was mainly for educators, then I highly recommend the course. Taught me a lot. So when Shruti asked me to talk about it, well, firstly, I changed it to wobble because balance would suggest that I actually ever achieve equipoise. I don't think I do. And I looked up the kind of definition. So it talks about 3 things: actions, decisions, obligations. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it, to us when we're working particularly, but also that defines your work and life like how much time, how do you decide when to work, how to work, and what obligations do you have within your life that you have in your control, and what isn't in your control, your obligations. So I chose to get married and I chose to have children, and so those are obligations to those people, but also to myself, to make sure that that's an enriched part of my life. And everything requires some investment in energy and time and focus. So actually, you can often feel that those two parts of life, work and outside of work, can be pitted against each other. And people talk about separation, and that's how you achieve balance. But for me, that's not how I've tackled it, actually. I've always thought about both. And, I often find that I'm doing something, really concentrating, and something outside of work will interrupt it. Whether it's a child being ill, or even that they've forgotten their PE kit. It's big and little stuff. And actually, we have one life, and it's pretty impossible to separate. And that's, it's not just about parenting, it's all sorts of parts of life. So what's particular about working in healthcare, and obviously being a doctor and then being a consultant, they're quite interesting, aren't they? So just have a think when you have a moment, what are your current challenges? And you may have had some conversations around this already today, but I encourage you to keep thinking about that. That's the basis of your appraisal when you start having consultant appraisals, is what is challenging you this year, and turning those challenges into development points and making a plan, recognizing that plans often go awry. And also, you may want to think about your challenges outside of work. Those you don't have to put in your PDP, but you can if you want to. So maybe you want to spend more time at home, or maybe you want to change your hours. I mean, these are important thoughts and questions to always consider, and things change over time. So most of us will appreciate Michelle Obama's great words that things aren't equal. And so she speaks as a woman, and this suggestion with women's liberation, that actually because you work, you can have it all. But actually, yes, you can do a bit of everything, but you can't always do everything to absolute max. There is a limited amount of energy and a time capacity. So learning to say no is really important, and also learning where your boundaries are. How far do you take responsibility? How good are you at delegating? How good are you at trusting other people to do things when you've asked them to? How do you ensure that people are comfortable telling you if things aren't working? Those issues around hierarchy and human factors are really important to think about. Much of this is bound up in our mental health and well-being, physical, mental health, and the psychosocial model, which is beloved of the current psychiatry curriculum, is very important in terms of treating a whole person. And I do agree with that, because actually mental health isn't about not having a mental or psychiatric disorder. It's about how are you and your state of well-being. Are you making the most of your opportunities? Can you manage the stresses in your life? Are you able to do that and contribute to your work, to your own development, and obviously the wider community, which for most of us is quite important. I'm always struck, I don't know, many of you may also get the BMJ and occasionally even read it. I always read the obituaries first, and perhaps particularly pertinent in recent times. It's interesting to see how much people's contribution to the community is noted, but actually in lots of ways that's a very diverse part of what we do in our life, and a very interesting part, but we rarely talk about it, particularly at work. And perhaps it's an interesting thing to talk about to your colleagues, just a thought. Oh yes, the WHO said this, so it wasn't just me. So if you care about yourself, you can then care for yourself, and then you can also care for others. So you have to have what we call self-love. My daughter's a teenager, and they're big on this in the secondary school that she goes to, self-love. And she definitely, whilst she's incredibly sarcastic, because teenagers often are, she doesn't disagree with this statement that actually you have to be able to look after yourself in every way, and that's important too. and that comes from mind. So, as I said, mind and body are not separate. So how do we integrate those? How do we make sure we look after both aspects of our health from that perspective? There's a bit about neurodevelopment that I think is quite useful to think about. Why do we fail at this actually? Because we do often, I do often take too many things on. I find myself trying to do 3 things at the same time and wondering why I'm stressed and why it's not going so well. And I do like the concept of old and new brain. So we have a sort of more primitive part of our neurology that, gets us up, gets us food, makes sure we don't get killed, make sure, some of that is very social as well. It's about relationships and making sure that you're safe in your tribe and so on. So really, fairly primitive but human drive, and those are survival aspects of our neurology. And obviously the world has changed a lot. So sometimes some of those more primitive drives are not necessarily helpful at all times in our new modern world. Some still are. It's quite conditional, I think. But we have this really clever brain over the top of it that likes to imagine and play and be creative and imagine the future and dream and have aspirations and desires. And that's an important aspect of human nature, and particularly useful when you think about development. Because consultant development would suggest that you are different each year and you get better each year, not that you've got your CCT, you've become a consultant and that's it. So it's useful to think about how we plan our lives, how we think about them. Rumination always sounds like a bad thing because we sort of overthink things. I think rumination can be useful as long as it doesn't overshadow everything else. And I particularly like when I'm off on leave for several weeks, I often come up with an answer to a thorny problem while I've not been thinking about it directly. There's clearly some stuff going on in my mind that I don't know about. And obviously memory and learning and education is a key part of that. How do we get better at stuff? By learning new stuff and working out how it fits in with the old stuff to make it cohesive. And obviously we know that we like to know other people, and there's lots of great things you can read about how human systems work and how many people in a group is good and what it's like being in a good group, what it's like being rejected by your group. There's really tricky stuff in there. And obviously our work community and our professional community is also a community, and it's not nice to not fit in there either. But that strongly drives some of our physiology as well, and might explain some of the poor behaviours you see at work in a poor culture if the leaders aren't on top of how everyone's social brains are behaving and what is permitted and what is rewarded. Very important stuff. So how do we regulate all of that? So there are these 3 systems that our brains have. So we have the one that keeps us going, drive us, makes us happy. We have one that when things are a bit stressful, we get soothed and feel safe and protected. And those are both in balance equally with the threat system of actually it's important to know if there's a threat. You can't just be really passive and happy, motivated and soothed and ignore a threat. Threat system is there for a good reason, but unfortunately our amygdala often defeats us and we end up in all sorts of difficult situations when that part of our system is allowed to go into overdrive. So a really useful way of thinking about why did I overreact then? What happened there? Or why did my colleague, what was going on for them? So you may want to talk probably later about something that you tend to do on autopilot, and is that a good thing? And do you ever ask for feedback about that? Particularly at work, it's important. I think the thing I've found most important as I've gone through all those consultant and other roles is that people stop giving you feedback. There's no, apart from the survey you need to get, people don't actually often tell you whether you've done something right or wrong or well or not so well. And I do think it's really useful to have a trusting relationship with your colleagues so that you can ask for feedback. So, for example, Shruti and I work together sometimes in sort of RCP staff or education staff, and I'll often ask her, how do you think I handled that meeting? Or, what do you think could have been done differently? which bits of what I did were, struck you as useful. And I think having those healthy, trusting relationships with your colleagues around you is really helpful. And I have lots of people that I use for that. So I encourage you to have people like that around you, and invite people to give you feedback as well, even when you don't solicit it. Make people comfortable in doing that. Equally, you have to be comfortable giving it to people, and that's important too. So I work hard on my own ability to deliver feedback that's fair and useful and authentic. We know we do all sorts of things without any conscious involvement, like driving. I often go, oh, I don't know how I got here, but I've done this drive so many times, I've not thought about it. That's fine, as long as we're alert to an occurrence on the way. Sometimes we get into bad autopilot, bad habits with people, and nobody tells you. So it's important to think about it. And of course, the flip side of that is being very mindful and paying attention, always paying attention on the moment. It's really hard. It's a good practice. There's obviously lots of theory around it. But, one of the things I find hard about it is that when I stray from being mindful, I start beating myself up about it. And then that stops me being mindful. So used correctly, it's very helpful. So why is everyone going on about it? Because actually, if we spend a bit of time just being in the present, it does help us to regulate the emotions, because often we're worrying about something we did and we're like, oh my God, that's so embarrassing, I can't believe I did that. Or, oh, I've got that terrible meeting tomorrow, it's going to be awful, and catastrophizing about something that hasn't happened. But actually, if we sit in the present and think, actually, I'm absolutely fine, I'm comfortable here, I'm not hungry, I'm perfectly calm, I'm safe, it can really give you a great emotional tether. And actually doing that regularly does dial down that stress response. It makes your amygdala much more useful, because it isn't going mad all the time. It's there when you need it, when actually that dinosaur does come and attack you. It's probably not polite to talk about my old colleagues like that. Anyway, but it does mean that your head is clearer then to make decisions. You can concentrate properly on what people are telling you, and not just the verbal and the non-verbal. And reading the room, it really does require an ability to be present. So important when you're a dean, by the way, because everybody wants to know what you think about everything, and unless you've been listening, that's quite hard. Meditation is great, and it's been proven to be good for your health, and for some people that's a really useful technique too. You don't have to be a meditator, and you don't have to go on a course. It's just about how do I feel right now? And this kind of 5 sense check-in is a really useful one. If you haven't got time to sit there and do your entire body scan. But actually, when you're feeling anxious, you think, well, actually, I can see a lot of people smiling at me and looking fine. I'm feeling comfortable. I'm not too hot, I'm not too cold. I can hear people chattering. They're clearly not all looking at me in shock. It's fine. Maybe you can smell some nice coffee or whatever you like, and just focusing on those 5 senses, and then it really grounds you, and can get all of that anxiety out if you need to. For me, a big part of this is gratitude as well. I mean, I'm genuinely really grateful for my life, and I do that very actively. I read a lot of research around gratitude when I was doing my leadership development course, and there's lots of evidence that it's really good for you, particularly people who like to write in a journal, which is an easy thing to study because you can tell they did it properly, and how they wrote, and you can see that actually that's an association with having a more positive approach to self-care through exercise, being optimistic, and actually the result would makes you a more effective person, in fact. So it's interesting. It's not by working harder that you can be more effective, but actually sometimes just taking stock of what you've done already and what you appreciate about the things around you, rather than looking for the problems, can actually make you more effective in both your career and practice, but also managing your life, particularly when it's complicated or intricate. So that's useful. And the thing that I did for a bit, I have to say I'm a bit slack on it now, but I tend to do it in my head at different moments, is particularly end of the day, actually, 3 things that were good or 3 things I'm grateful for at the end of a really busy day, often with lots of stresses and challenges. It's really helpful. And most of us, if we try hard enough, can find 3 things, even if it's I managed to put my shoes on without falling over, or probably scraping the barrel a bit. But, normally you can say I had that lovely conversation with, my patient and they were really grateful, and, or the person on the bus asked me how I was, or whatever it is, all sorts of stuff. For me, my family, a great source of joy for me, and I'm very conscious that we all tend to take time to thank each other for things. So for those of you who are wrestling with getting your kids to say thank you and please, keep going. It's definitely worth it. Equally, very important in our family. I have 3 children. They're always arguing. Forgiveness. So learning to forgive and accept apologies as well is really important part of conflict resolution, and that makes balance much easier to achieve, particularly because it can be really stressful when there's unresolved conflict. And actually, what you want is stress to be your friend. It needs to be a performance thing, like you're about to run a race in the Olympics. So you're like hyped up for good reason, because it's going to help your performance, not because someone is still upset with you about something you said to them 3.5 weeks ago and you haven't been able to open up that conflict and resolve it. So I think it's really important, if you've got conflict, not to bury it. You've got to find the right time and place to have the conversation and be very fair with and to that other person. And that will allow you to not consider stress as being this thing that you back away from, but actually resolve the conflict, move on, and then it becomes a much more useful part of your life. Grit, loads of great data on the concept of grit, just keeps coming out more and more. Angela Duckworth is a social scientist in America who came to lecture to us actually in Harvard on this concept. She spent years looking at it. Started off in primary schools in sort of dodgy bits of America, and she noticed that the people that did well were the ones not necessarily the cleverest, but the ones that kept going, that persevered. And actually in professions, we often have a lot of passion and perseverance. To be a doctor, you need this anyway. So never think that you don't have enough. Some days you might not, some weeks you might not, maybe even some months. But, you then have to think, well, why is that? Is my job not quite right for me? There are lots of reasons I changed my job plan over my time. And I knew when to stick with things, but also my future I saw very much as where I am now. And don't worry, I've got another future plan. I've still got another 10, 15 years to work. So I think it's always really important to keep going and stick at things and make sure that future actually becomes a reality. It's the nicest feeling. I can't tell you how lovely it was to be told that, I'd got the job as a dean, because it's something I'd been working towards for years. Talking. As you notice, I like talking. So listening is also quite important. But, the concept being that it's important to think about how you get on with things, asking people their opinion, asking people what matters to them, as you like. You can use whatever style you want. You don't have to borrow someone else's. Just think about how you like to interact with people. Most of us are involved in direct patient care, and if not, we do actually interact with humans a lot. So think a little bit about how that works. Don't be lonely. And you can do that by having lots of conversations with people, because otherwise the how are you, I'm fine, no one actually really cares what the answer is when you say how are you. Whereas if you say, hey, it's so nice to see you, what's been going on since I last saw you, or whatever, is a great opener, because then they choose something to talk to you about, and then you can carry on the conversation. How are you, I'm fine is not helpful. So yeah, find people to talk to, people you like talking to, and make sure you don't forget about them and keep in touch with them. You've got to love WhatsApp for that, haven't you? Right, this is again a Harvard Mason concept, which you will recognise as I explain it. So when you take on a job, and this is talked about by a guy called Jim Collins, who's a big management kind of guru. You inherit people in your team, and they're the passengers on your bus, and you're the driver because you're trying to like get them to somewhere because you're the leader. And because you've inherited them or you formed them, you have to get to know them all and work out if they're the right people. And just like any bus driver, you can't choose your passengers. They turn up, and you have to work out who to keep on your bus or not. So now the analogy stretches slightly, but the point is that they will get off your bus if the bus is going in the wrong direction for them. So it's really important to get to know your team. I'm a big reformer. I mean, reforming the name of an organisation, there was a lot more to it than that. There were a lot of people in there. I had to make sure I got the right passengers on the bus in terms of my council, my officers, and the team within the executive function as well had to be correct to be able to put that really big change through, because it's more than just the name. There's a lot there. I reformed medical education in my own trust, and now I'm busy reforming a deanery for all sorts of reasons. And that's one of my talents. And when I heard the lecture about this, it really struck a chord, because it's something that I'd been doing but felt uncomfortable with, perhaps limited by, but actually knowing that this was a kind of obvious concept that happens and being able to think about it like this depersonalized it, because it's not nice to think that you don't want someone in your team, and I'm someone who wants to be able to work with everybody, but sometimes the reality is that those people don't want to work in the way that you want the team to work, and that's really important fact to keep in mind as you go through your career. And also when you're choosing a consultant job, you need to think about whether you want to get on the bus, and don't go for a job where you don't feel like you're going to get on with the team or it's not right for you. Obviously temporary locum jobs, it's fine, try it out. And maybe you'll stay somewhere for a few years and move, that's cool too. But if you really have misgivings, you won't enjoy it, and it's stressful enough as it is. So you want to be somewhere where actually your colleagues support you and you enjoy it. Values. So we all love value-based everything at the moment. For me, value is not monetary in this concept. It's about qualities and what matters to you. And this is an exercise we use when we do our educational leadership course through medical education leaders. So we give people this list and we say, right, pick your top 10 and then pick your 5 and pick your 3, and now you've got to pick 1. And it's a really useful study in how all of these things are important. But everyone has their own values, and that's an important aspect of knowing what matters to you. And then as a leader, what you have to learn to do is be able to communicate that to others. So for example, in a team, in a clinical team, being able to have an atmosphere of trust might be the way that you would want to discuss that with people or state it, or supportiveness. You might be someone who's particularly interested in order. Your team needs to know that. You might be someone who likes to be challenged. Any of these, there's nothing wrong with any of them. Humour is quite important for me. Nothing's wrong with them. They're not all appropriate for a work context, but your inner values are important, and then you can use the context for your work values as well and think about that. So values are important, and you need to know what yours are, and then you need to know how to communicate that to people you work with so they understand you as well, because you'll be happier, they'll know how to work with you, and you'll know how to work with them. I mean, just going back again to a little bit briefly to health. We talked a bit about the mind and meditation. Sleep, so important. I mean, you've got someone who's a sleep consultant at your course, so she can tell you all about that. Healthy eating, physical fitness, important foundations of health. Don't neglect them, at least not in the medium to long term. We all do this slightly badly here and there short term, don't we? But you can't forget it forever. And that is the end of my narrative. I've given you a quote to think about, because, as I said right at the beginning, what interests me most is development. I think that if you see what happens as development opportunity, and that really conscious blend of support and challenge, to yourself, to your team, particularly when you're a supervisor. That's a really core supervisory balance of the, you're judging but also promoting someone at the same time. But then also giving people a break, including yourself. I mean, we tend to beat ourselves up about mistakes, don't we? But those, having an intended path, recognizing it won't always be linear and straight, giving ourselves a break, that gives us meaning in our life, and balanced or otherwise, particularly struck a chord. So I hope I've given you some ideas about how over a consultant career you might want to think about your balance. And also I would say there are moments where things are really tough, but as long as you stop, speak to the people you know care about you, and just take a break and think, that will pass, you will get through it, and you will work out where you need to be. It happens to us all. They're great learning experiences, but they're often quite painful at the time. So don't sit there on your own. Don't let them fester. Try and work out what it is you need to do to fix the situation. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I did put my email on the slide, and I'm very happy to be contacted via email or Twitter or whatever medium, carrier pigeon if you want. If you're not sure whether I really mean it, you can ask Ruti, because as I said, I always ask her what she thinks of what I've been up to. And good friends are wise counsel. So thank you so much, Ruti, for inviting me, and I'm very